morning, good afternoon to everybody. We hope that you and your families are well in these unprecedented times. On behalf of PULSAR team and the WorldBank, and despite all ongoing circumstances, we are happy to welcome you to our second joint PULSAR Focal workshop entitled Interpretation of Financial Information and the Use of Performance Indicators in the Public Sector. The main objective of this smart interactive talk is to discuss the existing methodology and the best way for its use in public sector, present IPSASB board position on the topic, explore the benefits of financial statements for investors and credit rating agencies, and present countries and cities' experience in using these kind of indicators. In order to achieve the proposed objective, today we are going to have an extraordinary panel of experts. The opening remarks will be delivered by Daniel Boyce and Xiomara Morel, both practice managers for Europe and Central Asia and Latin American Caribbean region, respectively. Then Ross Smith will provide IPSASB board vision on the topic, followed by Fergus McCormick, who will share the perspective of credit-rated agencies. Andres Bergman will talk about the topic from academic and standard setter perspective, as well as to share Switzerland experience with us. Emanuele Padovani and Alexander Heitlinger will share the experience of the European Cities for Sustainable Public Finances group and the City Economic and Financial Governance group. Magdalena Vicuña and Maria Teresa are going to welcome us on behalf of Focal team and also share Paraguay experience with us on the topic. The event will be finalized with a short question and answer session led by Jose Resk and Juan Carlos Serrano. And brief closing remarks will be provided by Armand Batian. I would like to remind you that all presentation, including the translations, will be available in the document section of the platform, which you could see on the right side of the screen, and later on you will be also able to download them from our website. Without further ado, and giving our ambitious agenda, I would like to pass floor to Daniel Boyce, practice manager of governance team for Eastern Europe and Central Asia region. Dan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dimitri. Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the World Bank, including our PULSAR and Focal teams that we work with and that work on these initiatives, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this second joint PULSAR and Focal virtual workshop, which we also call the Smart Interactive Talks. Today's topic is the interpretation of financial information and use of performance indicators in the public sector, which is a discussion I think is highly relevant, especially during these challenging times. We want to thank all of you for putting some time, allocating time in your schedules to meet this timing for this event, and hope that you and your families are doing well in spite of all the circumstances. Key performance indicators are widely used in the private sector as a way to understand whether an enterprise is achieving its objectives and also to use this feedback as an input for better decision making. In the public sector, we did have the new public management movement of the 1990s, which brought these concepts to government, and some governments adopted them in a significant way. However, in most countries, this information is either not produced or sometimes it's overproduced. And if it is produced, it's seldom used for making decisions, especially for longer term issues that governments are facing and have to deal with. I think it's especially true for accounting information since, first of all, the accounting information has tended to be cash-based, and also it's the tendency of the public sector managers to focus on the budget and other short-term indicators as they manage their day-to-day business. Now, as we're dealing with the COVID-19 situation, the economic shutdowns across the globe have brought economic crises with the global economy in a recession and unprecedented fiscal interventions. Both lower revenues and at the same time higher expenses by governments worldwide. This makes the adequate performance monitoring of public finances even more relevant when there's a growing demand from civil society for greater accountability in the use of these scarce public funds, especially those funds that are being used to address the health and the economic crises. So we have accounting in the center of this, underpinning the financial reporting frameworks, and therefore the use of financial information as performance indicators is also underpinned by accounting. And these indicators can include things like liquidity, return on equity, operational capacity, and it can be in the government as a whole or in specific state-owned enterprises or certain parts of government. All of these being entities that where it's worth having regular financial monitoring of the performance of the entity. So today we're going to explore this topic from several angles, including the standard setter viewpoint, as well as the importance of the topic for other stakeholders like investors and credit rating agencies. We'll also have an opportunity to hear diverse experiences both from the ECA and LAC countries. Finally, I'd like to share that the World Bank has been putting together a series of global knowledge papers. We've mentioned some of these in other events, but they're covering a wide range of topics in this COVID-19 context, including agile treasury, state continuity, anti-corruption, and resource mobilization. We just released a report called GovTech and Fraud Detection in Public Administration, which examines the most promising current and new technologies that can be applied to detect and prevent fraud and corruption in public administration, with a focus on procurement, integrated financial management information systems, and human resource systems. All of these are means for using data and using the broader information systems that the governments have to find patterns and to detect corruption and address it as soon as possible. So I encourage all of you to read these just-in-time publications, all done in the last few months, that can be found on the webpage of the Governance Global Practice of the World Bank. Thank you all again for being with us today. We hope you enjoyed today's event, and we're glad to continue fostering this collaboration between PULSAR and the Fiscal families. Back to you, Dimitri, for further proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Now I would like to invite Xiomara Morel, Governance Practice Manager for the region of Latin America and Caribbean, who will also welcome us on behalf of the Fiscal team.
Thank you, Dimitri, and good morning. Buenos días, buenas tardes a los que están en Europa y buenos.
Good morning and good afternoon to those of you who are in Latin America and Europe. It's an honor to be here with all the colleagues in IPSASB, the academics, Fergus, who we hadn't seen since Crecer last year, and all the colleagues from FOLCAD and PULSAR. Now I will switch to English so that you can all understand, including the interpreters.
To actually recognize the effort that the both teams, not only the technical teams of PULSAR and FOCAL are doing to have this joint event. For FOCAL, real y efectivamente, todos los colegas de FOCAL están.
All colleagues of FOCAL are connected in Latin America, and for some of them it's very early in the morning, but they have made an effort to be here. So I want to thank them, and I hope you're all okay in your families, as well as all other colleagues and the entire audience. Now we'll switch to English again.
The importance of the performance indicators, especially making emphasis on the private sector. I will not repeat everything that Dan has already said and the importance of having performance indicators in the public sector, but I would like to make 3 points just to complement what Dan has already mentioned and what our speakers countries would actually highlight in their presentations. Performance indicators are really a tool, and it's a tool that actually for us as accountants, we probably understand very well why they are important and why they actually provide a way to measure performance and to compare between entities, the performance of those entities. In that regard, I think we all as a family have to make a strong effort to make sure that our constituents in our countries and our ministers and our really parliamentarians and all those that actually make decisions, including investors, have the information available but that can be useful and that can be actually provide them with informed decisions for them to take forward. So I think one of the things that we have to highlight is that that acts as a thermometer, and as a thermometer for the sector, for the public sector. If we have performance indicators, it will actually be very useful to be more competitive and to actually open the doors for more accountability and transparency when we compare different localities, different central government, municipalities, performance, etc. So I think this opportunity that we have today provide us as a family, as I said before, and as colegas, as actually multilaterals, academia, investors, in the sense that we need to make a strong effort to ensure that our language, our narrative, our numbers make sense. I think one of the biggest challenges that we have is to actually convince our authorities in every single country that accounting is not just a mean to get numbers crunched, that accounting actually produce financial reporting that can be really, really, really the most important thing for them to allocate resources and to actually measure performance, to continue going into the path for development. So nevertheless, we know that in the public sector, there is not yet a clear consensus over a possible list of performance indicators. It's not as simple as saying we're going to follow the private sector, like we did with the IPSAS when it started the whole thing about taking into account the benchmark of IFRS, and then we developed the ones specific for the public sector. I think Dan pointed out to some of the things that are actually very useful in the public sector. I think the presenters are going to go into that, but I wanted to highlight that irrespective of any decision that governments take in terms of using accrual accounting or using those most common indicators like liquidity, debt ratio, etc., we actually have a work to do. And I think the work that we need to do is to support the country, to support the development agenda, making sure that information is useful and that that information is actually used for making decisions. That is actually, we see down the road that the financial statements, the public accounts are not just stay into a drawer and comply with the parliamentary, with the Congress, that we actually are showing in countries that this information is being used for the purpose of allocating resources, for efficiency and effectiveness, and to ensure that really the citizens know where the money goes. So my final point is that the public sector could strongly benefit from these performance indicators that should be adapted to the sector and that actually can provide the information not only on the public accounts, but also on the services provided. We all know that the IPSASB has issued some reports that some governments are using in terms of service delivery. So I think making the emphasis on the two perspectives, that we have the financial information, but also that we can complement the information on service delivery by the government, make a real combination of financial and non-financial information that the decision maker can use for have a broader analysis of the public sector entities and the government by the citizens and the stakeholders. That means that we have really an open space that we can induce, that we can influence. As a WorldBank, as Dan said, we are working with you together on these two networks to ensure that our voices are heard and that you can make a difference in all of your countries. So thank you very much. Congratulations to the organizers. And I'm very happy to be here for the second time on a joint event for PULSAR Focal. Welcome again, and let's have a productive discussion. And thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Xiomara, and good to see you with us. Now I would like to invite Ross to share some remarks from IPSAS board perspective.
Thank you, Dimitri, and thank you, Xiomara and Dan, for the great lead into this event. I think you've already touched on several of the very important points that I'll highlight in my presentation as I go through the IPSAS guidance and framework and share what's included in the various IPSAS and the recommended practice guidelines as it relates to performance measurement. I do think this is a very important topic, and it's also a live topic in both the public and the private sector, and it really gets to the heart of making financial information as useful as possible, which I do think is an issue in the public sector and one at the heart of the IPSASB's work. So with that, I'll get into the discussion. And I'll start with this slide. And on the left of the diagram here, you can see the 3 different colored circles. And the innermost circle, the blue circle, really relates to financial reporting and the IPSAs themselves, which are, we call in our framework, the general purpose financial statements. And that's where the entity tells the story about its financial performance. So within the financial statements and the IPSAS guidance, it really is focused on presenting financial information. And I'll get into more details later in the presentation about IPSAS guidance and how you can tell the financial story about an entity with IPSAS guidance. And the 2 outermost circles, the dark orange and the lighter orange, relate to the recommended practice guidelines that Xiomara already referenced in her opening remarks. And I'll explain a little bit about how you can move from the core financial information and start telling more of a broader story about an entity's performance in the recommended practice guidelines by looking at the non-financial reporting requirements as well as fiscal sustainability. And on the right side of the slide here, I've got a quick overview of the IPSASB strategic objective. And the purpose for putting this on the slide is really just to highlight that a key fundamental view of the IPSASB is that financial reporting and accrual financial reporting is at the heart of a good public financial management system. And it really is about entities telling their story from their financial statements and then using that information to tell the broader story and manage public finances. So a good public financial management system from an IPSASB perspective goes further than just the financial reporting aspect. It's really about using the accrual accounting information for as many purposes as possible. And that includes defining performance measures and performance indicators and telling the story of the entity outside the financial statements. And we'll get into that in more detail as we go through the various pieces of guidance. So at the heart, the blue concentric circle at the heart of the diagram, the previous slide, is really about the IPSAs and the guidance within IPSAs about telling the story, the accounting story and the financial story of an entity. And up front, before I get into it, I have to clarify for those who might not know the details of IPSAs, but IPSAs are really based on a principles-based style of setting guidance. So it defines principles that entities can use to tell their story. And it has a certain level of flexibility, but there are also requirements of the various financial statements that must be presented in a set of IPSAS financial statements. And within those financial statements, the various subtotals and categories that must be presented on if they're material, including the totals for each statement. But within the statements themselves, there is flexibility for an entity to apply its judgment and consider materiality to tell the story of its finances over a financial reporting period. And IPSAS 1 is the key standard to look to for understanding how to present and disclose information in an entity's financial statements. I would highlight here that IPSAS financial statements are really built off the concepts of an asset, a liability, revenue, expense, and surplus. And then within that uses additional line items to build up to those numbers throughout the financial statements and uses the notes of the financial statements to tell more of a story about the information presented in the financial statements. The key here again is that the information is really telling the financial story of the entity. It's not so much about defining what those public sector measures might be, although the IPSAs themselves do give various gross financial measures that are very useful for creating other financial metrics that could be useful for comparing with other public sector entities within a jurisdiction or globally. So it really is important to note that there is some flexibility in the IPSAS financial statement or financial framework that allows entities to really tell their financial story. And the normal financial statement ratios that you use in the private sector can be modified and used in the public sector to tell the story about liquidity and other types of metrics depending on the nature of the entity. I did want to highlight that there are also, in addition to the 3 IPSAs on the previous slide, there are 34 additional accrual IPSAs based on the type of transaction that give other presentation and disclosure requirements should you have transactions relating to those topics that would be required to be presented in the financial statements. And each of those individual IPSAs provide information on how to present that information. And again, it's in a very principled way that allows flexibility for the entity to tell its financial story. And again, it really is important that as part of a strong PFM system, the IPSAS financial statements aren't just used for financial reporting purposes, that information is captured and used for broader decision making. So it is useful as an input for budgeting. It is useful for an input for statistical reporting. It is good bottom-up audited quality information. And the real key is to make sure that entities are thinking about performance indicators and how to tell the story of the entity and the entities in the public sector. Now, moving out from the inner circle, we get into the orange second circle that really deals with what I've called non-financial reporting. And this relates to, in the IPSAS framework, the RPGs, or Recommended Practice Guidelines, which are non-mandatory guidance developed by the IPSASB to present information in general purpose financial reports. So this is information that is outside the financial statements, but builds off the information from the financial statements to tell the story of the entity. Now, the Financial Statement Discussion and Analysis RPG is consistent and similar to what in the private sector you might hear of called Management Discussion and Analysis. And it's really about presenting on the entity's objectives and strategies and linking those to the entity's financial statements and financial performance. And I did want to highlight that in RPG2, there is information on using non-GAAP or non-IPSAS measures, which is common in the private sector, as well as in the public sector in some jurisdictions. And there is a specific requirement in RPG2 that when using a financial measure from an IPSAS, based on an IPSAS from a financial statement, that you should ensure to describe and reconcile that measure back to the financial number in the IPSAS framework. And I think this is quite important. There is an ongoing debate in the private sector about the use of such non-GAAP measures. There's probably less of a debate in the public sector at the moment, but I think it is quite important that if you're using the financial information to come up with other measures and you're disclosing those in RPGs or other reports, that it's important that you reconcile those back to the IPSAS. Because again, the IPSAs are the audited up numbers that are reliable and relevant and tell the financial story. And if those are being used to tell another story, there should be a basis explained to the user so they can really understand what those non-GAAP or non-IPSAS measures are really about. And the other purpose and useful information you get from RPG2 really relates to the risks and uncertainties the entity is managing and how those might affect financial performance now and in the future. So for those jurisdictions that are in the process of adopting IPSAS, if you haven't looked at RPG2 yet and you're thinking about how to tell the story in your annual report or broader reporting of the entity more broadly than the financial statements, I highly recommend taking a look at RPG2 because it is a really user-friendly piece of guidance that's helpful in helping entities develop their framework for telling the story outside the financial statements and providing useful information to users. Sorry. Next, I want to move on to RPG3, Service Performance Information, which CMR has already highlighted in her introduction. And again, this is another piece of guidance the IPSASB developed a few years back that relates to general purpose financial reporting and providing information outside the financial statements. And it's really about a public sector focused piece of guidance that tells users about an entity's service performance information. And it's a principles-based, user-friendly piece of guidance that gives a framework for entities to define their quantitative performance indicators as well as qualitative performance indicators, and look at the resources it has, the inputs it puts in, and how those translate into outputs and outcomes, so that it can measure service performance across various lines of departments under which the entity operates. Again, if you're trying to tell your story and provide information that's useful to users, and in particular service recipients in this case, service performance information is another area where there's already a framework existing in IPSAS that can easily be applied in various jurisdictions to really start to tell the story, building off the financial statements, but more broad than in the financial statements, on how the entity is performing. And there is some really helpful piece of guidance in there on what efficiency and effectiveness are and how to measure those, as well as how to work through the difference between outputs and outcomes, which is really at the heart of service performance information and the quality of the services being provided to entities. And again, I would highly recommend, if you're in a jurisdiction that's adopting IPSAS at the moment, don't neglect looking at these RPGs, because they are really helpful in trying to develop how an entity wants to tell its story outside the financial statements. And I think these are really useful pieces of guidance to consider for that context. And the last RPG, and it's actually the first in the three that the IPSASB has issued, is the outermost circle from my first slide. And this relates to reporting on the long-term sustainability of an entity's finances. And again, I think this is a very important piece of guidance that has been developed 100% from a public sector perspective, and really looks to build off the financial information in the IPSAS financial statements, but then take a forward look over a period of time into the future and apply various assumptions that allow an entity to tell its story about its fiscal sustainability by looking at the three dimensions noted on the slide. So the service dimension, the revenue dimension, and the debt dimension. And within those various dimensions, the guidance provides thinking on how to look at the capacity for each dimension and the vulnerability to those dimensions. So what might change over time that might cause changes in levels of service, revenue, debt, and really help bring back a picture today of the sustainability of an entity's finances over a period of time. And I really do think this is another important area for entities to think about as they develop their IPSAS framework, if they want to really talk about the sustainability of the entity's finances over a period in the future. And I would like to highlight that within RPG 1, there is a glossary of indicators, mostly taken from statistical frameworks highlighted in Appendix C, that might be useful as well to consider when developing any performance indicators for your various jurisdiction. And I'd also like to highlight here that many jurisdictions that have been very successful in adopting accrual accounting frameworks and using that information to make better decisions really have thought about the performance indicator aspect. And I've heard many presentations over the years, but one in particular I'd like to highlight because it's a jurisdiction that's noted quite often as very successful, and one of the pioneers in the public finance area and accrual accounting, and that's New Zealand. And I've heard Ian Ball speak about this in the past, and he's one of the true leaders in this space, in that New Zealand transitioned to accrual way back in the late 80s and 90s. And he said one of the critical success factors that has really led New Zealand down a good path was when they started to put accrual into place, they actually defined performance indicators and put those into the legal language around the accrual information, so that the information from the financial statements has to be used to present certain indicators to Parliament and to consider against budgets each year. So it's making that financial information relevant and useful for comparing previous years. I won't go into detail what those are, but I do think if you're interested in that space, New Zealand's a potentially good good jurisdiction to look to on how to balance the accrual implementation and the performance indicators and make the information useful. And lastly, I just wanted to talk about some future work. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I do want to highlight that this is an important topic to the IPSASB, as well as in the private sector to the ISB, and there are a number of ongoing pieces of work related to this. So in the last strategy and work program consultation in 2018, the IPSASB did propose a specific topic on public sector performance indicators. And the purpose, or the proposed project, was to try and set out what true performance indicators for the public sector might look like, and get a little more granular on what might be useful to help entities start to think about performance indicators in a more consistent way across jurisdictions. Unfortunately, other priorities received more support, and this didn't make it to our active agenda, but we do have a mid-period work program consultation coming up in 2021, and this project will again be on the longer list of projects. There are a lot of projects the IPSASB does need to look at, so there's no guarantee that this one will make it to the final work program, but it will be there for constituents to comment on. We have a research project on our academic research agenda related to financial reporting in the public sector, and at the heart of this project will be getting to the heart of what financial performance is in the public sector and updating IPSAS-1 to better tell the story of public sector finances from a financial statement perspective. Another key initiative the IPSASB is working on at the moment is to create a government finance statistics alignment dashboard, and to continue to implement our current policy of aligning with government finance statistics guidance where possible. And we're working with a number of organizations at the moment to input to the ongoing SNA update process to try and make sure some of those areas where alignment's possible from a statistical and accounting perspective are considered in that SNA update. And lastly, and I won't spend much time on this, but I did want to flag that there is work on primary financial statements project in the private sector, and depending on that work, it could influence developments in the IPSAS project I've referenced previously. And as well, they have got a project on their management commentary, it's practice statement 2, which is essentially the private sector equivalent of our financial statement discussion and analysis. So we'll be watching that space as well to see if they make any further progress on providing relevant performance indicators and non-GAAP measures outside financial statements. And with that, I just want to say thank you again. I'm really looking forward to hearing the other presenters speak about what's going on in their various jurisdictions, as well as the question and answer at the end. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Ross. Now I would like to invite Fergus to share the relevance of use of financial analysis from perspective of credit rating agencies.
Thank you, Dimitri. Ross, good to hear from you. And thank you, PULSAR and Fiscal, for this very kind invitation to speak this morning. Let me open up a presentation now. So just give me a second to get that off the ground. Dimitri, remind me how to get this launched. Here it is. Nope.
Share screen.
Share screen, trying to find it. My apologies.
Top right corner.
Now the share screen button, top right corner. Got it. Just a minute. There it is. Thank you for bearing with me. Now, so today I'd like to address what the benefits are of financial statements based on IPSAS for investors and for credit rating agencies. Now, as you know, investors have a very different mandate from that of credit rating analysts. So forgive me if I walk you through the very basics, but I think we'll all find it helpful if I just begin with the basic facts, and that is investors objective is to increase real adjusted returns above and beyond anything else. They take strategic positions, they take tactical positions in the market based on price discovery and based on value discovery. Credit rating analysts, on the other hand, assess credit risk. And that is a very, very specific mandate. And that is to simply assess the probability of default of a central government or a general government in most cases on its bonded debt that's held by the private sector. Now, in the case of Moody's, they also assess expected loss given default. But that is not the case with S&P and Fitch and the vast majority of the other rating agencies. But what is the relevance of financial statements then to the financial markets? Well, IPSAS-based financial statements, as we know, produce a balance sheet. And this is a complement to the traditional statistical reporting. And I would argue, after 20 years experience having built DBRS Morningstar sovereign ratings group from 1 credit rating to 41 credit ratings around the world, is that a balance sheet is really critical to understanding a government's strengths and its weaknesses and its overall effectiveness, how transparent and accountable it is, what its priorities are, how well it's governed, how it makes decisions, and also how well, how much value public officials are creating. Now, how does it do this? Well, a balance sheet informs, provides more information about the fiscal stance, about the financial position, about the fiscal position. It also sheds light on the debt strategy and, in particular, asset liability management, which is really missing from traditional economic statistics. Coordination and funding of public sector entities, which is becoming more and more important nowadays, and also profits and losses of government-controlled entities. And then a balance sheet produces the indispensable fundamental indicators, in my view. And these are the operating balance, the net debt, and net worth. An example, once again, is New Zealand. If you look at New Zealand's balance sheet, it is the gold standard of financial reporting. This is taken from financial statements as of June 30th of last year. And you can see very, very clearly the liabilities on one side of the different entities of the government, the entities under the stewardship of the government, and then the assets on the other side. And then at the bottom, you can see the net worth. So if you take it from the top, obviously the debt management office has, liabilities. Third down, the Kiwi Bank, which is a national bank, and other commercial entities are running a slight net asset position. Stakes in listed companies have a slight or even larger net asset position. One of the second biggest liability is the Earthquake Commission, an accident compensation corporation. Public housing, incredibly well managed, has an asset position overall. They even have the central bank, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, which has a net asset position. The pension funds, very, very rare to see a government report it in this manner, a big net asset position. And then they valued and managed land and offices and infrastructure, overall providing net worth, which they use, as Ross mentioned, for policy purposes. So I would argue that there is a positive relation between transparency, which includes financial statements, and market performance. So for a sovereign, IPSAS and GFS provide a standard reporting framework, as we know. But few governments actually adhere to this standard. Even fewer use financial statements for budgeting. And the question is why? Well, several answers are that they simply don't have the capacity to do so. They don't appreciate the value, so they may be ignorant of the value that financial statements provide. Or, which is very common, they fear the consequences of disclosing this information. They may have something to hide, or they're focused on the near term and use mainly a cash budget. But there is a positive relationship between transparency and market performance. So from an investor's perspective, inadequate data and poor fiscal transparency create misperceptions of sovereign risk and value. And this leads to a mispricing of risk. If investors don't know something, they tend to require a greater risk premium. So the bond yield is higher. From a rating agency perspective, inadequate data, poor fiscal transparency tend to result in a lower sovereign credit rating. It's not a one-to-one correlation, but it most certainly exists. A lack of information creates overall uncertainty. This distorts credit assessments, and it leads analysts to assume the worst. And by contrast, and this is a very, very important point, the more information disclosed, there's plenty of academic literature that proves that there is typically a higher credit rating and a narrower bond spreads. So it's cheaper for a government that is more transparent. Improving disclosure is also a structural fiscal reform. So investors and rating analysts invariably look benignly on reforms. So improving disclosure is really considered very positively by investors, by rating analysts. Of course, this is only the case if there is an increase in transparency and that this transparency is communicated clearly to the market. I think for countries, except for the countries that are approaching default, who are in a different category, this means that incremental improvements in disclosure also improve a country's risk perception and its creditworthiness, even if the information increases liabilities and exposes poor management. So let me say that again. Even if the information is poor, even if the information is bad, it makes a government look bad. Overall, it's better if a government discloses what it's on its balance sheet. Why? Because it reduces uncertainty, and investors can't stand uncertainty. Now, this is the case for both economic statistics under GFS and then also the financial statements under IPSAS and also GFS. Now, there are plenty of market skeptics. In fact, the vast majority of investors and rating analysts just don't pay any attention to financial statements, and very few even know what they are. These skeptics tend to be people who simply fail to recognize the value of financial statements or a balance sheet. Investors whose only objective also is to boost real adjusted returns. That's their only, many investors ignore financial statements, are concerned only about the quarterly real adjusted returns. Skeptics also tend to be rating analysts who view risk in a pro-cyclical manner. So they upgrade when GDP improves, when GDP goes down, they downgrade, or whose ratings track those of other rating agencies. There is herd mentality in the rating industry, and financial statements produce a balance sheet which necessarily forces policymakers to look into the medium term. And then skeptics are also investors or analysts who are held back by regulatory constraints, methodological constraints, or simply don't have the internal capacity to look also into financial statements. On the other side of the coin, there are an increasing number of enthusiasts, and these are investors or rating analysts who take a longer-term view of the consolidated public sector. They view the balance sheet as a risk management tool. They track and appreciate the value of marginal increases in fiscal transparency. And they monitor the governance component of ESG, or environmental, social, and governance factors, for integration into their investment frameworks or for engagement with issuers. So those who advocate for particular outcomes or those who integrate ESG factors into their investment frameworks. And that is becoming very, very popular nowadays. And they monitor the governance component, of which financial statements are a very important piece. So the overall point is that increasing fiscal transparency can improve creditworthiness. Now, I would argue that increasing fiscal transparency is one of the easiest and the quickest ways for a government to improve its credit quality. A government can do this by simply providing a balance sheet with existing data, explain the data gaps and what the government's doing toward improving those gaps, and then improving budgeting by taking these factors into account. Second of all, consistently improving data disclosure within the context, as Ross mentioned, of a public financial management system. A government can also produce simplified presentations of the data in addition to full presentations. And in light of that, communicate regularly with investors and rating analysts. And with that, I'll turn it back to Dimitri. Thank you.
Thank you, Fergus. Now, I would like to invite Emmanuel and Alexander, who will share with us the experience of a group of European cities in using financial performance indicators. Before that, dear participants, please send your questions via chat. Thank you.
Okay, good morning. I don't know whether, Dimitri, we come first and then Andreas Bergam, or vice versa. I think Andreas Bergam would come before of us, right? I don't know.
Right, you're totally right. Andres, sorry very much. I missed the order in the agenda.
No worries, no worries. I could have done it the other way around. So, but I'm happy to go now. Buenos días, estimados amigos en Latinoamérica. Es un gran placer estar con ustedes hoy y compartir algunas.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you in Latin America today, and I wanted to share with you some of our experience with performance indicators. But I am going to switch into English now for the benefit of the participants and also for the interpreters.
The focal countries, I'm very pleased to be with you today and to share some thoughts about performance indicators. I firstly will take on my academic hat and talk about the academic perspective. As Xiomara has said, that's not very much to talk about, but still, there are a few thoughts from this angle. Then I will talk about the standard setter perspective, and I will also show some results on a study we did about the use of performance indicators. And finally, I will come to a conclusion. So really from an academic perspective, if you look for literature, for articles, for books, this is generally information about the private sector, about corporates, about companies, and about financial investors such as the ones Fergus was talking about just a minute ago. Looking more from a management side, it's really much about controlling, about management accounting, which are the indicators that managers of companies are using for their decision making. Now, this of course refers to the sales, refers to their investments, refers to their gains and losses in their commercial activities. Financial analysts, as we have heard from Fergus, are of course also looking at the financial performance, however, less so at the level of individual products or individual services provided, but much rather at the level of the investment into a share or into a bond, and therefore how this investment is performing in terms of dividends or interests or changes in value. But what about the public sector? Well, as Xiomara has already said, there's very little around, and perhaps the only things which are around are really about fiscal policy, so about economics. And that's pretty much what you find in the Annex C of RPG1, which Ross talked about. So that's a summary of what you can find about fiscal policy indicators in the literature. But bottom line, it's really not a lot. That's why I switch now to the standard setters perspective. And of course, I concur with Ross on what IPSASB has done. IPSAS has alluded to the use of financial indicators based on financial statements, and therefore I think this is a valuable source. But I'm not going to repeat what Ross has already presented, but I'm really focusing on the Swiss experience. As most of you might know, I was not only a member of IPSASB, but I'm still a member of SRS CSPCP, which is the Swiss Standard Setter. Apologies for the long acronym. The first 3 letters are in German and the next 5 ones in French and Italian. So that's why we have so many letters. The Swiss Standard Setter has issued a harmonized accounting model, as it is called. That's the name of the standard. It's called HAM in English. And it has a long tradition of defining performance indicators. Actually, in the very first issue of the Harmonized Accounting Model, which was published in 1977, so that was when I was 9 years old, so I had nothing to do with that, of course. They already defined performance indicators. And also in the current version, which is called HAM2, and which is based on IPSASB, they include performance indicators. They actually have two recommendations, as they are called, or standards, number 17 and number 18. Number 17, which is on fiscal targets and instruments, and number 18 is on financial indicators. Very similar to IPSASB, SRS CSPCP is also focusing on financial indicators and less so on performance indicators. So we leave that to the respective domains. So please ask the engineers or the educators if you want to see indicators about their fields, or the doctors about health. Now let's have a look. What are the indicators which are currently included in HAM2 in recommendations 17 and 18? They have prioritized actually the indicators. They have defined a total of 8 indicators, 3 of them being first priority. And how did they prioritize them? Well, basically based on what they call stakeholder needs. Now, if you look at the definition of stakeholders in HAM2, this looks very similar actually to the stakeholders we call users in the IPSASB conceptual framework. So probably the stakeholder needs are therefore very similar to the user needs, which were defined by IPSASB. The stakeholders are general public or politicians, management, financial investors, as well as Fergus has pointed out, and financial statistics. Now let's have a look at the indicators. So the 3 first priority indicators given the needs of the stakeholders are the net debt ratio, the self-financing of investments ratio, and the interest burden ratio. Net debt and interest burden, these are sort of very traditional fiscal indicators, and you also find them in a lot of fiscal policy literature. However, perhaps more curiously, they included self-financing of investments, another ratio which is perhaps less well known. What is it about? It is about actually how much of the investments a government is undertaking can be financed either out of the profit, either out of the surplus of the year, or can be financed out of depreciation charges, or out of other funds set aside by the government itself. So without taking any external lenders or any external borrowing, how much can be invested. This ratio is traditionally typically around 60%. So about 60% of the investments, for instance, in infrastructure, in buildings, in IT, was financed by surpluses as well as by depreciation charges. And the rest, of course, the other 40% were financed by borrowing, and this is, of course, also a valid way to finance, but the balance of those two sources of funding appears to be very critical for the Swiss standard setter and the stakeholders in Switzerland. The second priority indicators are again net debt, but this time per inhabitant, self-financing again, but this time in percent of the revenue, capital service charges, which is very similar to interest burden ratio, the gross debt ratio, which is very similar to the net debt ratio, except that the net debt ratio takes into consideration financial assets, and finally the investment ratio. So this all is explained in those 2 standards, and in the annex you find also exact formula, targets, etc. You find on this slide a few of the indicators are shaded in yellow. These are really the ones which require full balance sheet, which require full accrual data and which could not be calculated in a modified accrual or even in a cash-based accounting system. Now, we as academics really wanted to know, and it's not the latest article I have published, but it's actually one of the most cited articles I have published, wanted to know, is this data really being used? So is actually the Swiss standard set right in assessing that these indicators are important for the stakeholders? And in fact, the finding is yes, they are. So first of all, we found out that yes, the indicators are way easier to communicate and way easier to use, for instance, in the political debate than the full financial reporting information. And this is in line with what Ian Ball has said, and Ross has quoted him. So it really helps to make good use of high quality financial reporting information. And interestingly, by far, the most used indicator is self-financing of investments ratio. So the one I just explained, this is by far the most used indicator. It's about 5.5 times more often used than the next one, which is the net debt ratio. So really, this brings evidence that indicators, and in particular indicators which require full accrual data, are used by decision makers, by politicians, by media in the public debate, and they are used very, very strongly.
И эти показатели используются очень-очень сильно. Я уже готов перейти к выводам. Показатели должны основываться только на конкретном.
From the private sector, emphasizing, for instance, also citizens and parliamentarians as part of the users group. Secondly, yes, there are full accrual-based performance indicators, and they are relevant to users. And finally, I think this is also good news. Indicators, they do help to communicate financial reporting information. With that, thank you very much for the attention, and I'm of course staying on for the question and answer session towards the end of the event. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Andres. Now, our next speaker is Emmanuel and Alexander. Please go ahead.
Okay, good morning. First of all, let me say that I'm really happy to be here with you and thank you again for the invitation. I will be presenting the experiences of European cities. So we refer to the level of government, the lowest level of government in Europe, referring to the City Economic Financial Governance Group, and it will be my part of the presentation, and CSPF, which will be Alexander Eiklinger's presentation. In my first part, I would like to present you what we have done inside the CFG, who basically is an exercise of comparing financial health across countries, financial condition across countries. We have applied this idea, and actually this was basically a need by a first group of city members, Barcelona, Dublin, Hamburg, London, Milan, and Vienna in 2014. So at that time, we were just back from the basically the problems of the 2008-2009 financial crisis, the sovereign and the sub-sovereign debt crisis in Europe. The project basically wanted to compare financial and accounting data among these few European cities, and with the final hand to understand and mutual learning. Then in 2015, roughly 18 months later, we have ended up with this financial health template. And then later on, other cities joined the team, and also for these cities, we also applied this financial health template. So despite the fact that we have done several other stuff inside this project, I'm focused on this financial health template, or what we have labeled financial health template. Which were the dilemmas in comparing what I have written here, the perhaps incomparable, different administrative traditions, different systems in general, different cultures, and also different languages. They were, technically speaking, other than this administrative tradition, cultural tradition, there were four most important dilemmas we need to face with. First of all, dilemma number one. A few of these countries, or a few of these city governments, talked in terms of government financial statistics, which is a totally different domain than government financial reporting. The first one refers and has a much macroeconomic perspective, while the second one has the perspective of a single entity. So an entity, a single entity, and its financial management. The second dilemma was much more related to this dilemma of traditional accounting, cash accounting, versus new public management approaches, basically accrual accounting. But we discovered that there were many, many nuances in between. The third dilemma was also what we have started with, this idea of having several perspectives on how to measure financial sustainability or financial conditions. So we ended up in both theory and practice, plethora of different KPIs. Fourth dilemma is the jurisdiction perimeter, because if you consider the entities that also provide a service and where managers, for example, are appointed, or entities that belong to the jurisdictional sphere of the city government, we end up into a very blurred environment around the city government, around the particular entity. We have also already talked about this state-owned enterprises at the very local level. The first thing, the complexity, which I think is extremely important from a technical perspective, how can I say, a calculative perspective, is the idea that we ended up in discovering that not only that we were in front of different accounting systems implemented, they should have been implemented by law, but also several other systems. So in certain cities, there were up to 4 different accounting systems. Also the perimeter was quite blurring. Certain city governments neither have a clear overview of the perimeter in itself, a clear number of entities that could have been included in the perimeter. The financial health template, we started the consideration of different, let's say, frameworks available, and you might be aware of some of them. Here you have a list. I'm not interested in going to the detail because we don't have time, but just to provide you the idea that this complexity was also at the level of frameworks available. So we ended up with our financial health template that was a sort of hybridization of the accounting system and the different traditions that basically where the city governments were located, and at the same time the different frameworks available at the international level. Some of them strictly focused on local governments, others not. And we ended up, again, I'm not interested in going into the detail, but having just a general overview, in a system where we have a statement of operating performance, a capital operation statement divided into 2 parts, capital financial flows and capital creation or consumption. And as you can see here, we have mixed up ideas coming from the different fields, government financial statistics and government and financial reporting ideas, financial flows, and cash statements divided into 3 different statements. And we have selected 10 KPIs. You can have an overview, a detailed overview, by going to the document that you have in the document section online. And you can also see already that a few of these KPIs, 10 KPIs, have been already mentioned by my colleagues also. What have you learned? What has emerged? The possibility to make, for example, a comparison that was not possible beforehand. And here you have a comparison between Amsterdam and Barcelona. Barcelona is a little bit worse in terms of the debt, but they are very similar in other dimensions. And also having the possibility to compare along the time. And here you have the operating balance. What has emerged finally, and I'm going to the conclusion. I was really impressed at the beginning to hear that language that makes sense. And actually, the first two statements that you find here are extremely related to this. We finally see what we do with accounting is an expression that I hear with my ears from one of the CFOs involved. The sense-making of financial impact of policies at an international level was one of the most important ideas that we did since the beginning, but then we proved to be, to a certain extent, possible. We need then to communicate this to policymakers and citizens, which is far than easy. Perhaps we have also had some rating agencies involved in our discussions. It could be extremely interesting for comparability of data, while at the same time there is a slow-moving accounting harmonization throughout Europe with the IPSASB, the European Public Sector Accounting Standards. So other than the material already uploaded, here it's a list of publications. The first and the third are in English and are both available. Thank you. I give the floor to Alexander, my colleague. I'm sorry if I was 45 seconds later.
Thank you, Manuel. Alexander.
You have to leave. I will now also try to share. If I find my slides. One second. Can you see the slides already? Does it work?
Not yet. I can't.
Then I have the same issue as we had in the rehearsal. One second. Now?
Now, yes.
Wait a minute. Now you should have the slides, correct? Can you see them now? Yes?
No, we can't.
Not really.
You cannot see them?
We see your screen. When you handle the share screen, choose the presentation there.
This is what I just did, but I'm going out again. And,
choose application window, not the entire screen.
Yeah. And then.
No, when you go to share screen, there are different options. Share the full screen or share the application. You need to choose application.
And I give you now the
application window.
Yeah, this is what I did, and then I go there, I share it, and at the same time I have my slides already. I can see them perfectly. You can see them now?
Let me do it for you.
That's very nice. I'm so sorry that it did not work this time, like yesterday. Perfect.
Can you see it?
Sí, perfect. Good afternoon. Muy buenas tardes, muy buenos días a los compañeros también de América Latina y del Sur.
Good afternoon, and it's for me a great pleasure to share this experience from Europe. I'm here in Barcelona, but I will speak in English because the slides are in English.
I'm very pleased now to the colleagues from the WorldBank group, especially to Dimitri, and also for their support to let us share what we call a new group of cities working together. Emanuela has already, let's say, outlined the CFG group, which worked for 6 years very successfully together under a different umbrella. But now we have created some of these cities, a new group which we call European Cities for Sustainable Public Finances. On the next slide, you can see who is, let's say, working together. What is most important for us, it is a group of high-level, let's say, personalities. It was very important for us to have the CEOs and CFOs of the various cities. Why? Because Emanuel already said that, and also what several of you said before, there's a very strong need between financial figures produced by many financial departments at the city level and bridge them to the policymakers or explain them to the cities. And very often CFOs, and we heard that also in one of the concrete cases of Amsterdam, are working in the ivory towers, produce a lot, but it's then not always used. CFOs and CEOs are mostly used, as we figured it out also over the years, and now with our new group, when we have a financial crisis, or when there are crises there. This was especially when the years from 2010 to 11 to 12 in Europe, as well as right now, again, with COVID. We had already this year many, let's say, virtual meetings to discuss how can the COVID issue be, let's say, treated from the financial point of view. We have a new host. It is housed now in an Austrian organization, which is called KDZ, the Center for Public Administration Research, which is working for municipalities with and for municipalities in the Austrian context. But there was a kind of a competition of several European organizations who wanted to host the CFPF, which you have also the website, let's say, mentioned here. I don't want to repeat the different objectives because Emanuel already said it, and it was music to my eyes. What, for example, Giomara said, sound financial management is key, sustainability is key, transparency, but it has never been done, or it's never been, let's say, still done across Europe at city level. This kind of comparison, as Emanuel already, let's say, explained, is unique still, because we have a lot of European city networks, but none of them are dealing with economic and financial issues. We are also extremely proud. It was already done previously in the CFG group, but now again in the CSPF group, that the European Commission is acknowledging the partnership with us and also supporting us through active participation, because as we know, they have also, let's say, taken on a long journey in order to establish, if they succeed, because we know the IPSAS is a fantastic and very strong framework already existing in the formulation of, let's say, we call it a European IPSAS system. When you look at the next slide, you can see the cities who work together, when the change, are diverse, but all of them have something in common. We have capital cities, of course, we have secondary cities, let's say, economically very strong, but we have also, let's say, other criteria when we select them, and I also come back then a little later how we select them, that they all have a very strong leap towards quality in the city management, towards modernization. All of them, they have, let's say, innovative aspects in the city management. And this is also important not only in the financial terms, but also in general. And here you have some city facts. You can also find them on the website, but I would like to go to the next one, because what is making it very special, this city group, is let's say the format. We became over the years a family. It is a trust worthy relationship we have. We meet twice a year, normally always physically, face to face. This it was not possible, and we have also, let's say, a special code of conduct when we let's say meet with each other. As you saw, we have 7 cities currently in the CSPF included. We have conversations also with the city of Vienna and with the city of Budapest, but they have already internally a kind of set a threshold of maximum 10 cities to work together in that sense, because then you can have also these privacy issues, you can have this interactive issue you can also keep, let's say, that everybody has a voice and a vote. It's very important. So we have, let's say, a very collaborative approach when we deal with all these things. What is also important for some of the cities that we have exclusive membership of the CSPF. That means one city per country. That has nothing to do that the city is the best city. It also has to do that we have, of course, would like to compare and work, share and exchange cross-border mainly. In addition, what I said, each of the groups, they receive reports. We do also with Emanuele together different, let's say, final annual finding statements and reports. And of course, for them, it's also important. But nowadays, and if, as we heard also from the rating agency, the visibility that your city or the respective city is positioned well in financial terms has, let's say, a kind of credibility or reputation of being a sound financial managed city. This is also very important in that context. When we look at, and I finish with that, to the next years, very collaborative, and the next slide shows the roadmap for the next 2 years. And this was my last slide. It is not a surprise that the 7 cities, when they jointly decided on the next topics, we have actually 2 groups of it. One are the SDGs. We have spoken a lot about them. We have put them on the political level a lot about them, but I think only some of the externalities or some of these crisis issues which just has happened brought them into more financial, let's say, framework. So we decided to work on the SDGs from the financial side, which is very interesting, not only SDG budgeting, but we are now planning in our next meeting, which is on the 10th of 11th of December, unfortunately, virtually, to start up to come up with such a financial health template or financial joint statement where we have the SDGs already included. We selected SDG 11, 13, SDG 7 for the next 2 meetings. And the second big priority, of course, not only for us in Europe and also because in the view of the next financial period and the new funding which will come to Europe is the digital part, digitalization. Digital finance has been also chosen, and there we will look, of course, from the security side, how datafication, artificial intelligence will, let's say, can have and will have an effect on the public finance. I leave it here. Thanks for that, let's say, short slot. And of course, if there are any questions, both Emanuele and myself, who will accompany and chair this group, are available. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. Alexander, we will continue with our agenda. I will ask, thank you, Magdalena. Voy a pasar la palabra a Magdalena y María Teresa, quienes van a...
Give the floor to Magdalena and María Teresa.
Noon. On behalf of the forum of FOCAL, I greet you warmly. I'm pleased to be here with the PULSAR member countries, the speakers, and the speakers from the World Bank. With the support of the IDB, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, in November of 2014, we set up our forum as a network of constant contact with the objective of becoming a space for analysis, studies, reflection, and exchange of experiences, as well as knowledge and best practices, so as to work towards strengthening public accounting. The idea is that financial information be useful for decision-making. In subsequent years, the in-person annual meetings were held in Colombia, Paraguay, Panama, Argentina, and Brazil. In Brazil, Ecuador assumed the chairmanship and consequently had the 7th FOCAL meeting programmed for August of this year. But because of the current circumstances, that meeting had to be postponed. Now, as part of the working plan, we had decided to make good use of everything that had been done in the 6 years of Focal's operations, and also to have member countries help in the implementation of international standards for public accounting and other issues of common interest. Video conferences have been held monthly with the participation of international experts, analyzing, amongst other topics, the financial statements with the use of IPSASB. The Public Sector Department of the University of Applied Sciences in Zurich has helped us with the analysis of different norms, income from transactions with no offset, with emphasis on income tax, IPSAS 21 and 26, recognition of deterioration, and 31 intangible assets. Now, also, we have support regarding the role of auditing in the process of implementing IGSPs and technological progress using tools that are helpful for government accounting. In May and June of 2020, Focal, working with Etnes Sandyun and IPSASB, held 3 video conferences on norms: 70, income with performance obligations; 71, income without performance obligations; and 72, transfer expenses, where it was said that each draft norm should include comments received from the countries. And consequently, the Forum of Government Accountants of Latin America delivered a consolidated document including the responses received from 11 countries. And that means that Latin America has participation in analyzing these standards, and that Latin America's recommendations will be considered. In June of this year, with the support of the IDB and the IMF, an event was called Experiences of Focal Countries was held. And during that meeting, we talked about preparing management for public finances in view of the challenges of COVID-19 on the part of the IMF. And experiences were shared regarding the management of the experience. And also, we had general presentations on budgetary practices adapted in different countries, the definition of a legal framework, the financial impact, discovery on financial statements, also transparency and accountability, as well as management of foreign debt. In coordination with the IDB and OLACEF, we had the participation of controllers from Mexico, Chile, and Ecuador to talk about convergence and accountability to improve the management of public resources, responsibility and management in the management of public resources, as well as oversight, responsibility, and financial management in processes of convergence so as to have good accountability. At the call of the World Bank, the exchange of experiences across countries between Focal and PULSAR is in line with the goals of our forum. And today, thanks to Maria Teresa, we will hear from Paraguay. Maria Teresa will be talking about how her country is using performance indicators. I call on Maria Teresa. Thank you. Hello, everyone. It is a pleasure to be with you today. I greet the World Bank, the PULSAR group, and I thank you for inviting me to participate. I want to support these virtual meetings. This is a way where we can all keep in touch. Now, I am going to begin by sharing my screen.
Let's give her a couple of minutes to reconnect. María Teresa, si
Sí,
escuchas,
ya.
¿quieres que yo comparte la presentación por ti?
Un ratito voy a ver si...
You want me to share your presentation? I'm going to refresh. I was trying to refresh to see if I could get my presentation to come up. But no. Yesterday we did the rehearsal. Okay, it is on the screen, Maria Teresa, so go ahead. Great. Dimitri, do you have my presentation up? Yes, it's on the screen. Great. I will proceed with my presentation. When I was asked to tell you about Paraguay's experience in terms of financial indicators, the first thing that I thought of was I was wondering, do we have those indicators? Do we share them normally? And in our financial report that is presented every year, we do present a statement, just as all countries do. Usually this is an annual presentation. It goes to the comptroller and then to Parliament. We have a chapter, let's call it a chapter, where we do present these indicators, the financial sector indicators that are part of the consolidated report presented by the General Accounting Office. Now, our financial management law and our regulatory decree lay out the reports that have to be included in the annual report. That annual report, basically what it does is indicate that we have to present a consolidated report. We have to look at origin and application of funds. Also, we need to present a statement on execution. We have to report on revenues as well as expenditures. So it's budgetary execution. Also, we have to have a balance sheet from the National Treasury. And also, there has to be a report on public debt. So this is a very comprehensive report. It contains information from the central government, from decentralized agencies, and from all of the municipalities, as well as the corporations that are controlled by the government. So these are the legal requirements. This is what our financial analysis needs to include. Now, this is the chapter that we write in that overall report. Now, I have been at the ministry for 30 years. For that period of time, I have served the accounting department. So that is our practice, our custom. Why do I say our custom? Because before we had a manual going back to 1982. And when Andreas was talking about 1977, I was thinking back. And that manual, that was our accounting manual from 1982, and it had a whole chapter talking about these ratios. And it explained each of these analyses, and there were something like 20 different indicators. Now, as a matter of custom, those that have survived, those that are in the notes and the financial statements that are part of the explanations that are always included in the financial report, we have 5 indicators that are currently part of the financial analysis. Now, that financial analysis, and we talked about it a lot, we call them financial ratios, and that is a custom inherited from the old manual. But right now, these ratios are no longer part of our manual, but we do continue to incorporate them as part of our financial reporting. So basically, it is an analysis where we present assets, liabilities, revenues, expenditures, net worth, and we do this on a yearly basis to report on the financial performance in a given period of time. So we talk about liquidity, profitability, financial leverage, coverage. So basically the 5 indicators. And obviously, I'm not going to tell you how you produce those indicators because I think that this is something that everyone knows. But often, this information is not used, although this is very valuable information. So here I wanted to show you information from 2018. This is information from 2018 for the closing in 2019. This comes out of our financial report. And here we're looking at the short-term solvency or liquidity ratio. And here you can see the cash and the ability that Treasury has to pay its short-term obligations. Then this shows a comparison from one year to the next. In 2019, we can see that the situation was affected in the closing for that year. In Paraguay, there was an increase in the deficit, and that is clear by looking at these indicators. Most of the comparisons were negative when compared to 2018. And then with that, we can go to Treasury, or the acid test, as it's called, and that too compares current liabilities with available assets. And here again, you can see the correlation between the 2 years in this indicator. Now, I'm going to go through this quickly. You can download this presentation. This is part of the file that will be shared. But I did want to comment on this indicator because I think it's very interesting, especially for the closing we're seeing here for 2019. Here we see payments. You can see strengthening of infrastructure on one hand, but also support of that infrastructure. And this was a special year. In addition to the pandemic, I think that all countries have had to strengthen their health systems by building more hospitals, more infrastructure, procuring more equipment, and also buying medicine. And all of that has affected our expenditures. So I think that the closing for 2020 will teach us a lot in terms of what we have done in this fiscal year. The same can be said about current assets compared to current liabilities. Basically, in this space, the short term and the potential increase. In our case, there was actually a decrease in terms of the comparison between 2018 and 2019. And then the fifth indicator that is part of this financial report, where we talk about technical solvency, here in this ratio, you can see that we're comparing current assets with short-term or current debt. And you can see how an entity can cover in Guaraníes, you know that our currency is the Guarani, to pay short-term debt. And here we see a difference. You can see a positive difference in this comparison between 2018 and 2019. So as you can see, these are 5 indicators that are part of our financial statements. And in concluding my presentation, and I know that we are the last to speak, so everybody may be a bit tired, but I would like to wrap up. This is something that we're all working on together. When last week I was asked to make this presentation, I said indicators, and I was thinking back, because I've been here for 30 years in this department, I'm thinking, okay, where did those indicators come from? These are indicators that we are accustomed to including in the set of financial statements. This is our annual reporting practice. And we see, thinking back, we see that we do have more information in terms of each fiscal year. And I wanted to draw a parallel between a closed-end exercise, 2018, 2019, and we do have more information about those closings. Generally, people refer more to where the accounts were at the point of closing. They look at the level of indebtedness, the level of investment. And these indicators do give us complementary information on these closings, these macroeconomic data, and usually that is used by the countries. So I'm thinking, okay, what is the major challenge that we face as we analyze this issue? Our main challenge is to make sure that government officials use this information. And when I talk about indicators, and here I basically agree with what Xiomara was saying. It seems that all these indicators have been tucked away. They've been gathering dust on a shelf because our manual, our old manual that went back 35, 36 years, it already had an entire chapter containing several, actually more than 20 indicators. And we continue to follow that manual more as a matter of custom because nothing compels us to put these ratios into our financial statements, but we have done so. And I think that the challenge is to get our authorities, our decision makers, to use these indicators. But these were thoughts that I was having while I was preparing my presentation. And now that I hear the other speakers, I realize that these are indicators that we need to use. And I think that that is my final message. So the first thing that we as accountants have to be convinced of is that these ratios are necessary. They're important to support financial decision making. We talk a lot about accounting, but no one seems to remember these indicators. And that is why I am so interested in this issue. Although this was a quick overview, I wanted to participate because I think that we're not making the necessary use of this tool. And it goes very much in keeping with our financial statements. So decision makers, politicians often don't look at balance sheets. Or maybe that's only the case in Paraguay. And we always joke about this. Politicians, our authorities are interested in execution. That is what they understand best. But financial statements, they respect them. Economists don't like looking at balance sheets. And for me, it was a pleasure to participate in this meeting and make this presentation that has to do with financial statements. Now, this brings me to the end of my presentation. And I just wanted to say that a lot of you have been to Paraguay. We're right in the heart of South America. We're a small country, but you've probably heard that we have fought this pandemic quite well. You may have heard. So thank you very much. Thank you. And I am very much at your disposal if you have any questions. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Maria Teresa.
Thank you very much, Maria Teresa. I think we will now go into the Q&A question.
Little time left. Juan Carlos and Jose, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dimitri. I hope you can hear me well. First of all, I want to really thank everyone because we have received a number of questions today from the audience. So we might not have the time to really respond to every question, but we will start with one of the first questions, which I think can really help us to initiate an interesting debate. And this question comes from Mr. Ivan. Let me bring it. Ivan Castillo, and he's asking, or his comment is that typically the ministries of finance privilege the use of budgeting information over the use of accounting information. No, they typically prefer to use the budget information over the accounting. What can we do to better position the use of the actual information? And this is something that actually relates a lot strongly with the conclusions made by Maria Teresa. So if you please, we open the floor to the speakers. If you please provide your comments on this. Thank you.
Well, if I may, I think it is something I have been discussing for a while, that we really need to have sort of an integrated view of public financial management. So we need to look at budgets, of course, but we also need to look at accounting information and also at statistical information, and that all in one context. And then, of course, I think it is obvious that the accounting indicators will also play a role. I'm not saying they should play the only role, but play one role amongst the other indicators.
Thank you, Andres. I would like to invite any two other speakers if you want to provide your comments, please.
Yo puedo.
If I may, I would like to make a comment. as I said in my conclusion, it is quite a challenge for our authorities, for our politicians and decision makers to use our financial reports, our balance sheets, because these indicators are contained therein as well. And international organizations have been promoting this improvement in the last few years to have a greater level of information in the financial statements. The IMF manual, which is used in the budgetary execution statements to calculate fiscal results, has been very helpful in this regard. It has allowed us to make progress in this struggle, because it is a struggle, to position accounting and financial statements in the agenda of the authorities, of politicians, and citizens themselves. We probably have still a long way to go, but this type of meetings and these fora allow us to get together and share ideas around the public accounting standards. And these standards help us also in this regard. Maybe the progress is not as fast as we want, but I think we have made progress in the last few years. That's all I had to say. Thank you. I would also like to add something in this regard. Focal has been trying to position government accounting as an element for the information required for decision making. However, we see that in many countries, the most important information, the most relevant information is of a budgetary nature. So in that regard, we would like to have the support of IPSASB, the World Bank, the IMF, and the IDB to change that perspective and to give new relevance to financial information in the context of decision making. Budgetary information, budgetary execution information is readily available, and it is the scope of this use is for government entities. But if we do consolidated reports for the public sector, that information takes a bit longer to be captured for the use in financial statements. So I think for international standards, the International Standards Board should take into account the integration of budgetary, financial, and treasury information, and that it should be reflected in these standards. If we analyze the standards 70, 71, and 72, we see that many things cannot be applied in our countries because we have integrated systems. So these fora are very useful to take these issues into account. Maybe someday we will be able to say that decisions are made on the basis of financial information, and that this information is really given the importance it deserves. Thank you, Magdalena, and thank you all for your contributions. I agree with all the comments.
To my colleague, José Rest, he will present another question.
Thank you, Juan Carlos, and thanks everyone for such interesting presentations and also for sparking this very interesting discussion. We're gonna follow up with a question from our colleague, Leonardo Nascimento. We have performance indicators disseminated in the private sector with a financial focus, such as liquidity, indebtedness, or solvency. But there are also indicators with a broader focus, such as return on equity, return on assets. So it's common sense that this indicator provide an overview, but must be compared with indicators not obtained from non-accounting information. The question is, would it be useful to analyze these indicators in the context for segment reporting in IPSAS 22, for example? And I would like to first invite Andreas to give us his view on this. Andreas, please.
Thank you. I think really the segment reporting might be one angle, but it really depends on the definition of the segments. So segment reporting, IPSAS 18 leaves it quite open, which is the definition of the segments. And so if the segments are defined on a decision-oriented basis, for instance, a budgetary basis, they could be well used and well positioned to define those indicators. However, if you, for instance, choose geographical segments, they might be less useful in this context.
Thanks, Andrea. And now I would like to invite other panelists to briefly touch on this. Yes, Ross.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's an interesting question on the segment information, and I just highlight that in the last strategy, the IPSASB did consider whether it should look at a project to align with the current private sector standard IFRS 8 operating segments, which is an even more flexible standard in terms of how you present your information. Unfortunately, that project didn't make it right to the top of our list, but it was very close. And this might be an area where we'll do work in the next year or so to further align with IFRS and improve the segment reporting guidance. So maybe stay tuned in that space, because there might be an option that might be able to help coming down the pipeline in that area. Thank you.
Thanks, Ross. Back to Juan Serrano.
Thank you. Dimitri, do we have time for an additional question, or?
I think there is another question. Let me release one of the microphone. Anara, do we have a question? Can you hear me?
Dimitri, we have one from the Contraloría de Chile. Maybe I can bring it if you want. Dimitri, can you hear me?
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. I think we already...
So let me bring this question, additional question. This
maybe Juan Carlos.
Supreme Audit Institution of Chile, and I will present it in Spanish, because that's how we receive it. Considerando un modelo de pago centralizado.
Account a centralized payment system of accounts receivable, and the fact that the public sector entities depend on fiscal support, indicators to be analyzed for financial information can be done on a consolidated basis, or is it possible to obtain a question on this regard by sector?
En español igualmente para el beneficio de los traductores.
Let me answer in Spanish. I will talk about the Treasury single account. This is a very interesting question. In my experience, those countries that have a single treasury account, that is to say that all their cash is placed in a single account, these countries calculate liquidity at that same level. That is to say, at a consolidated level. In Switzerland, for example, we do have a single treasury account, and we calculate liquidity at the level of these entities, the entities that have access to the single account. But it's not logical to make a calculation for each of the entities, because their participation in the account is flexible.
I think we are running late, so...
Well, if there is any additional speakers that want to come in.
Can you hear me?
Otherwise, we could.
Juan Carlos, can you hear me?
Dimitri.
Can you hear me?
Back to Dimitri then.
Jose, you can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, sorry. Yes, we're running late, so I think we will be finalizing this question and answer session. Before passing the floor to Arman, I would like to announce that our next event will take place on December the 1st from 2 to 4:30 Central European Time, 8 a.m. DC time. It will be different. I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Did you hear the last part I said?
Yes, on the December 1st event, right?
Right. It will be different type of event to be delivered in format of regional Europe and Central Asia public official workshop focused on discussion of debt and investment reporting transparency agenda. Arman, the floor is yours for the final remarks. Thank you.
Rich presentation and actual discussions. As performance indicators are easier to understand than the financial statements, so officials, parliamentarians, investors, credit rating agencies, they better understand and expect us to produce performance indicators. Of course, for various reasons, including for comparison within the country and outside of the country. As it was indicated, numbers make sense and use it to improve the performance indicators and for public financial management improvement. Just simply financial statements, they are not sufficient if we do not add those performance indicators. It was very interesting to hear back from the IPSAS on the latest board on the IPSAS and RPGs, how also to not IPSAS, non-IPSAS basis. Also from what the credit rating agencies are looking for, specific indicators were presented in their presentation. And so they assume the worst. So if we do not disclose those, present those, they assume that the worst. And of course, with a very clear message is that transparency, it means cheaper to attract finance, which is critical for our government nowadays, particularly nowadays. It was also interesting to hear from Swiss, from Andres, that HAM, which is they were using as PIs as part of their standards, including with focus on their debt and interest as well as self-financing of investments. Of course, the practicality brought by the European cities was very interesting to learn as well, including budget statistical versus financial reporting, cash versus different bases for accrual. Consolidation boundaries was also shared as a key challenge for what reporting entity were going to produce those ratios. Of course, those are giving a lot of information for our country to think about. And it was very interesting to hear from Fiscal, Ecuador and Paraguay about their experience with even they have, like in Paraguay, they have annual report. Is that that all the focus, we can see that it's more on the debt, and this is, of course, pandemic had its impact, debt and investment transparency. As Dmitry said, we have planned a dedicated event on December 1 to elaborate on that topic. Thanks again and for rich discussion, and passing back to Dmitry.
Thank you, Arman. Thanks to all the speakers, Xiomara, Dan, Juan Carlos, Jose. For our PULSAR colleagues, please don't forget to provide your inputs to our publication on public sector accounting reform compendium in PULSAR countries. Many thanks to those countries that already did that. Thank you again for joining us, and please stay safe and have a great rest of the day. See you in our next events.